All right, so we're going to get started here. Thanks everyone for joining. Those of you who are out there and unable to join live, you'll be getting this link recorded. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that all around the world, people are in an unusual scenario. And for a lot of us, this has meant a bit of a panic mode, a bit of uncertainty, a bit of fear. And for some of us, this has meant loved ones and friends being hospitalized. And for many people, this has meant people have died. And because of something that has surprised a lot of humans that came out onto the world and affected a lot of people. So I just want to take a moment first to acknowledge that we're in a new version of how humans are interacting with each other and dealing with something like this. We haven't dealt with a phenomenon quite of this scale, impacting quite so many in a very long time. And so today we're really excited because we get to talk about some of the perspective on that might be helpful to some of you, might not. I just want to first introduce who's on the call today with us. My name is Finian Makepeace. I'm one of the co-founders of Kiss the Ground, and I'm also one of the lead instructors for the Soil Advocate Training. I just want to start by saying I am not an expert in coronavirus and this subject of the virus itself. But what I'm excited to talk about today is a bit about humanity's perspective that's emerging on many different fronts, not just on the coronavirus front, but what's emerging through the mental shift that humanity can access and hopefully can be a major help for all of us. So that's why I'm excited to be here. And I've had the honor over the years of working with and connecting with many of the pioneering scientists and leaders in the regenerative ag healthy soil movement to get a lot of this cutting edge information about more of the possibilities out there. So again, not holding expertise in this subject particularly, but hopefully today we can bring in some of the forefront of the thought leadership and science understandings that have allowed the regenerative ag and soil health movement to take hold around the world and see where that might apply today. So passing it over to Rishi, and then we'll introduce our special guest.
Yeah, hi everyone. I am Farmer Rishi, and I'm an urban farmer based here in Los Angeles, California. I'm actually at one of my locations here in the suburbs, which is called the Growing Home in Diamond Bar, and it's actually my parents' house. And I have been involved with Kiss the Ground for the past year, teaching the regenerative gardening and living course. And really what my work is about is helping people to kind of shift their view into this, what we'll be talking about today, this regenerative view, and how from that regenerative view, these practices will arise that really allow us to see the world as it is, and then contribute in a way where we can find health personally, and where we can find health in this in this larger body of ours that we call Earth. And that's what I've been doing for the past 10 years, what I didn't know I was doing, what I'm learning. I'm learning myself. That's what my work has been about. Yeah, so I'm really excited to be here, be part of this conversation, and just see if we can find something a little more hopeful and a little more healing from the situation that we're in currently.
Great, and introducing David R. Montgomery. He's a MacArthur Fellow and a professor of geomorphology at the University of Washington. He studies landscape evolution and the effects of geological processes on ecological systems and human societies. An author of award-winning popular science books and several of Kiss the Ground's favorite books on the subject of soil health and regenerative agriculture, to name a few of them: Dirt, The Hidden Half of Nature, and Growing a Revolution. We just learned David's also working on a new book right at this moment. He's been featured in documentary films, network cable news, and on a wide variety of TV and radio programs. His books have been translated into 9 languages. You can connect with him at www.dig2grow with the number 2 grow.com, or follow him on Twitter at dig2grow on Twitter. So with that, we wanted to welcome David. We, for some reason, are still not getting his video, and hopefully we are working on our back end to change that.
Yeah, you guys need to send. You just need to send me the link, not a clickable link, the actual link, so I can get it into Chrome and not Safari, because it won't work with Safari.
Great. Tracy, can you get on that for David? Not the clickable link, the link to the Chrome link. Are you on Chrome, Rishi?
I'm in the Zoom app on my computer.
Great. So I'm so sorry, David. Tracy's gonna try to figure that out, but at this exact moment, I don't have the answer for that. So we're gonna listen to your voice and get you on video as soon as possible. Our apologies for that. So we wanted to give a little more context. Again, the purpose of this conversation is not necessarily to dissect all of the hows and what is going on systematically right now with this virus, but to provide potentially a new context for the audience to look at this current situation from what we would call, and what Rishi just mentioned, this regenerative view or context. So we wanted to start by talking about this regenerative view and how it can be described. So David, we wanted to just throw over to you. How do you talk to people about what sometimes is referred to as a regenerative view, regenerative thinking, holistic lens, emergent mind, natural versus mechanical mind? How do you describe this to people, and what framing do you set up so people can be ready to listen to a potential new perspective, which would be the regenerative thinking mind on something like this subject?
Let me see if I can get this to work here. It's not. Probably the way for me to actually get this to work is to log back out and come in. But the short answer to your question is, I'm a geologist, so I mostly think about the relationship of people to the land. And it's the fundamental foundational connection that underpins all civilizations. And it's the one that we put at risk if we actually degenerate the land. So, the stuff I've been writing out for 10 years is right aligned with Kiss the Ground sort of mission and philosophy. And the way I kind of look at it is that the opportunity that we have to actually promote regenerative practices in agriculture is a real opportunity to remake our relationship with the world, and to do it in a way that would actually foster life as opposed to mining life. This is the only planet that we know of that has life on it in the universe. It's an incredibly special deal. And we've been kind of making our living now for about 10,000 years with the kind of agriculture that has been mining fertility out of the world for the most part. There's notable exceptions, and there's farms all around the world that have been turning it around lately. But trying to convert that kind of a regenerative framing into the new view of what we think agriculture should be, the new conventional agriculture, is a real sea change in our relationship with the land. I called it the 5th agricultural revolution in my most recent book, Growing a Revolution, for a reason. It would be revolutionary. And there's principles, there's practices, there's a lot of lessons we can learn from farmers that are doing it. But it really does start in the mind, how we think about our relationship to the land, how we think about the soil. And I'll kick it back to you guys, see if I can get the video back on here for a moment.
Yeah, I just want to add in here what you just mentioned, David, about changing the mindset, and that's really where this originates from, and the mindset that we've been operating in as a culture has really allowed for all these degenerative practices to emerge. And I was, I share this in every single one of my classes, and whenever I do a talk, that I was looking up the definition of nature, and Oxford has since changed this on their website, but I'm pretty sure this is the definition that was there for several years. So the Oxford definition of nature, I'm going to read this. the phenomena of the physical world collectively, including plants, animals, the landscape, and other features and products of the earth, as opposed to humans or human creations. And this is really the view that we've been operating from, that we are in opposition to the earth. We are in opposition to plants. We are in opposition to animals, and that view of how do we manage that opposition. And I think environmentally, what we've been focusing on is how do we reduce that opposition, when the new view that we're trying to move towards is actually just seeing that that opposition is not there, and that we are the earth, we are nature. How do we develop practices that nourish that relationship that we already have?
Hey, thank you, Rishi, for that. And David, did you want to try to sign back out and back in? We are hearing from Tracy that she has sent over a link for you to get in. Have you been able to try that again?
Yeah, I've tried it, but now I'm waiting for the password reset to come, since there's some password I have no idea about that was accompanied that. It's not a clean link.
Very sorry. I don't know why this is occurring like this today, and our apologies on that end. So I wanted to just check in again a bit more about building this, and David, you touched on this a second ago, but historically there are many societies that have arguably lived inside of what is referred to often as the natural, or tending to be an emergent mind, meaning that it's the society at large is paying attention to those phenomena that are happening inside of the natural setting and trying to work within it, versus trying to have superiority over it or trying to control it in what we oftentimes call the mechanical mind. So when we've seen the vast uptick, especially agriculture in the last 200 years, but even much more before that, we've seen this controlled mechanical mind dominating in a lot of regions across the world. And the consequences of that, David, you've spoken about this in your talks in your book Dirt as well. Could you talk a little bit more about that, give a little more clarity around globally? And again, we're not talking about every society, but a majority of societies that have moved into agriculture have unfortunately fallen victim to not working inside of the natural system and depleting it. And so can you give us a little bit more perspective on that 10,000 years or so of time where we've been generally in a degenerative connection to the natural world, and give people how that mentality is, how it functions?
Sure, and if you look at probably the single most powerful thing that has undermined societies throughout history agriculturally has simply been the plow. And it's kind of odd and ironic that that's the case, but if you think about our basic relationship to the soil, the way that a geologist like myself thinks about the soil, it's something that's made very slowly. Nature takes centuries to make an inch or two of fertile topsoil. It turns out we can do it a lot faster, but that's we'll get there in the discussion, I'm sure. But in looking backwards, the idea of tillage is one that allowed us to extract fertility from the land and turn it into crops and grow it into societies. And it was something that the degradation of the land that accompanies that plays out fairly slowly. So it's actually hard to recognize year to year, let alone over a lifetime. Yet if you integrate it over generations, you find readily documentable examples of how it degraded the land to the point in different regions around the world where large populations were not as healthily supported as they had been in the past, thereby rendering them vulnerable to disruption. The real challenge in that is, how do you actually farm in ways that enhances the fertility of the land, integrated over multiple farmers, multiple generations? And that's the challenge. The whole idea about, you're thinking 7 generations ahead. This is something we need to apply in agriculture as well. And it turns out that there's ways to do it, but we've had to learn that. And we've had to basically go through many examples around the world of trying to figure out those practices. And from my perspective, having gone through 10 years now of sort of looking into and studying this kind of stuff, that there's a way to do that by looking at combining some very traditional practices, things like cover crops and crop rotations, and planting legumes in a rotation, things that were traditional practices all over the world because they were discovered to actually enhance and maintain fertility. But if you kept it going with a lot of mechanical disturbance, you can still degrade the land over time. And now we've got the opportunity to combine modern science with the ancient wisdom of traditional practices at scale, both from small scale vegetable farms right on up to very large grain operations,
Right.
and really change the nature of that relationship. And I just got the password reset confirmation, so I may be able to get in here in a minute.
Awesome. So with that, that's so perfect to set up for my next question for you. Thanks for giving that overview. And when we look at current rates in the United States, the average rate of topsoil loss is 4 tons of topsoil per acre per year. Globally, that's happening at different rates, but somewhere around that is what's happening globally. Now, when we take a perspective of time, that's varied, but generally what we're saying is agriculture in general has been causing this disruption and this loss of this fertile topsoil. So let's take for a second, David, because this will introduce a bit more about one of your other books, The Hidden Half of Nature. When we're losing fertile topsoil, we're not just losing the ability for plants that we want to eat to grow, meaning losing land that is no longer available for crop production because it's so depleted. We're also losing in this biological matrix, this cosmos of interconnected biology that's being taken off the land. So when we recognize that in healthy soil, you can have a teaspoonful of that holds more microorganisms than there are people on planet Earth, and then recognizing at the same time that those organisms have evolved to work in symbiosis and sometimes in a competitive balance that's really been maximized to allow for the most life to prosper. When we're losing that soil at such rates, I wanted to see if you can jump into now, what are we losing when it comes to the health of the land, when we're losing this matrix of life that is in this intricate balance and provides so much of these balancing and other sides of equations. So we'll get more into it specifically, but I wanted to start off with that. I think we lost him. So Richie, do you want to talk a little bit about that side of it before David comes in terms of the loss of biology and really what that can mean when we look at it, even a system in a garden, when we're dealing with predatory relationships where one organism species can all of a sudden get a clear plate to go bananas, so to speak, when there's less biology to balance it. What do you see in gardening settings when someone says, well, everything seems fine, I planted it, now I'm getting attacked? Well, what's missing is the biology, right?
Yeah, and let me just start from a cultural view again, because I think that's really important. And a mindset view is, we have this idea that, okay, well, we planted the seed, the plant came up, it's got sunlight, it's got water. What else could it need, right? And we're not really most people, when they're starting in their garden, they don't understand that the soil is not just a place for plants to put their roots. The soil is actually the digestive system of the plant, right? The digestive system, just like we have our digestive system where we chew up food in our mouths, we inoculate it with bacteria, we bring it into our stomach, we churn it up more until we form soil ourselves, which we put roots into and gather nutrients from. The plants are doing the same process, or rather, we have encapsulated the plant's process. The plants have this process external of their roots. And so when we have soil that hasn't been cared for, soil that has been, I tend to view this, instead of talking about tillage and working the soil so much, I think of it more in terms of abuse, and what happens when, what happens when any living being is abused. We close up, we retreat, we kind of coil up, and this is exactly what the soil does when the soil is abused. It tightens, it coils up, it doesn't want to express itself. And so what we get is this soil that is not really wanting to work with us, because we are not seeing that we're not working with the soil.
Right.
And so this is really important, that we understand that this is a mutual relationship, and that we can't put seeds in the ground and expect them to grow and expect them to be healthy when we haven't done the work to first, build the fundamentals of that relationship, right? The soil is not going to work for you unless you've put in a little love for the soil to begin with.
Yeah, and it's a conditioning. It's that conditioning. Are you helping to create the conditions, whether it's mentally for a person, a child, to prosper, right, or those microbes? And as Rishi's pointing out, I just wanted to share in the phenomenon of regeneration, what's one of the most exciting things is this term we call latent seed banks. And this also applies to latent microbiology that's just waiting. I mean, these things have evolved, so they don't just all die. A lot of them are just waiting. And the cool thing about being a land steward is you can help set the conditions where these things come back out to work with inside that system. And they are so essential for making certain minerals be accessible to the plant, making certain things be able to happen to balance the system and protect the plant, therefore allowing the plant to prosper and share more sugars with them so that they prosper. That's that regenerative cycle being kicked on when you're helping with the conditions. So it looks like we might have David Montgomery back. There he is.
Oh, there we go.
Hey,
all right.
Welcome, David.
The video too.
We're just in here. So we were just touching a bit about the garden scale of what it looks like when you're missing biology and not taking care of it, not creating the conditions for the biology to prosper such that your plants can be protected and not as defenseless against pests. So jumping back to you, David, we had a question that I set up for you about connecting on a broad scale, human scale, of what happens when we lose that biology. Did we cover that, or were we just getting into that?
No, that link cut out. I think we were just getting into that. But what we've really learned in the last few decades is just how fundamental life in the soil is to the functions of the soil that we need to survive through the agriculture that feeds us. If you think back to like the 17th century, we didn't even know microbes were around, right? It was a revelation that these tiny little things could do anything. And it wasn't until the early 1800s that people realized they were actually useful. They could make beer and wine. And yeah, and in the last few decades, we've come to learn just how important communities of life in the soil are to the ability of crops to actually get minerals out of the particles that are in the rock particles, the soil particles that are in the ground. That mycorrhizal fungi facilitate getting phosphorus out of. How did plants grow so vibrantly without all these nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers that we use in agriculture today? Natural ecosystems are incredibly productive. How did it work? A lot of it was with partnerships between life in the soil and the plants. And it goes all the way back to the plants first colonizing the continents. The very first land plant fossils we have mycorrhizal fungi around the roots. These are ancient relationships, but we're just kind of learning about them. We still don't even know about half the species that are in the soil, right? It's sort of a great unknown, and let alone what they do. Imagine what you would know about the ecology of the Amazon if you just knew a few of the species.
Yeah, and I think this is a good point.
Go ahead.
To bring up, that I always like to remind ourselves that there are all these indigenous cultures that have lived in these ways and that have that really direct and intimate experience with the gardens that they live in. One of the examples that in my life that has really stood out to me of this very intimate relationship with soil is when I visited Hawaii and I stayed with an indigenous family there that was restarting their historic taro farm. And what I learned there was that, one, Hawaiian taro farming is some of the most productive agriculture in the world, if not the most productive. And the way that they create this productivity is actually by enhancing the cycles that are existing on the land. What they do is they pull water from their rivers and create these man-made wetlands where they grow the taro, and the taro is acting as an expanded wetland, an expanded filtration system of the river, and gathering the nutrients that are kind of polluting the river, you might say, and turning them into food. And so these Hawaiian farmers are actually doing the environment a service through their farm while growing their food. And so they had so much time to surf and hula dance, you know, because their agriculture was so productive, and they had and they were working with, you know, they're recognizing the needs of the land and doing their farming in a way that fulfilled those needs.
So just want to jump real quick into a segment here on that note. So with most agriculture, especially industrialized agriculture, and then leading into this green revolution, which hasn't been so green in terms of the chemical revolution, right now the statistics tell us that we're losing 30 million acres of land per year. England is 32 million acres, so nearly the size of England being lost of land that was farmable is now being put aside as too degraded to farm. That's the rate we're currently at. And then we've seen this explosion over the past 30, 40 years of chemical use from India to China to Australia, all over the world, heavy and heavier amounts of chemical usage. So I wanted to get your perspective, David, on the tendency of land depletion and what that means for specifically when we're talking about this virus. When we don't have localized ecosystems, or this virus or many different viruses or the next virus or what have you, when we don't have local ecosystems that can remain in their balance, what does this mean for the advancement of potentially new viruses? So when we're losing this much land and having to go exploit new land or cut down new forests to create new cropland or soy fields, what does this potentially mean for allowing for new viruses to emerge that were in their own ecosystem? They were, you know, having their own cycle inside of an ecosystem. All of a sudden, humans saying, well, we depleted all this land over here. We now need all this new land to provide our needs to feed ourselves. So now we're all of a sudden accessing or bringing into the picture viruses that were one time in their own silo. So can you talk a bit about that historically, potentially, of what this has meant for new viruses coming into the picture when we're in the degenerative perspective of land?
Well, I think there's a very clear connection with this contemporary pandemic, in the sense that none of us have any immunity to it. Like, this has not been in people before, apparently. And so it is a new introduction out of disturbing a natural environment that has now cascaded through our population. You know, I'm not qualified to talk about, you know, things in the past that may have related to previous pandemics, but things like the Black Death, that was a different story. It was a different mechanism. But the idea that we need to that it would be wise to preserve as much as nature as we can as we struggle to feed ourselves on this planet is true for many reasons, just one of which is the one that you have your finger on there. But there's many others as well, in terms of, if you look at, you know, the reserve of potential antibiotics and potential antivirals, the soil is actually the dominant source of many of them, and they've all been discovered quite by accident, and there are probably still ones there waiting to be discovered that we don't know about, as long as we keep those organisms around on the planet. There's far more microbes are actually beneficial to us and higher organisms than the pathogens. But as is obviously the case today, the pathogens can wreak havoc on us and previous societies, and we need to worry about them. We need to try and minimize our exposure to them and the opportunities that we provide them to cascade through our population.
So just on that, on the regenerative side,
Mm-hmm.
when we grasp how much we're currently losing of land, and then that's essentially saying, well, we still have to feed ourselves. Where's the new land going to come from? In the regenerative perspective, when we start to see not only degraded land reclaimed and regenerated, as Rishi was kind of pointing to, we're seeing a potential of not having to, even if we reach 10 billion people, people are like, oh, we got to feed the world. We're going to have to keep exploiting. Be like, no, in the regenerative perspective, we're saying we can increase yields on land that is depleted and even regenerate land that is almost vastly gone.
There's multiple ways to look at that. And one of the biggest, I think, myths of the 20th century is that we need large-scale industrialized monocultures to feed the world of the future. If you want to look at essentially the way to produce the most food per hectare for people, it's on small-scale diversified farms. Small-scale labor-intensive farms is the way to grow more food per hectare. You're not going to grow more corn per hectare that way, or more wheat per hectare that way, but you can grow more food. And so, there's multiple dimensions to balancing the problem of feeding the world of the future. One is obviously the number of people on the planet. Another is what we're eating. What's the mix of our diet? And the third is how we grow it. And that's where the regenerative perspective comes in, is if we can actually increase crop yields while rebuilding soil fertility, then then people will not be as tempted to clear another patch of native forest or to expand things. And as you're saying, Finian, there's a huge opportunity in the world to restore degraded land through regenerative practices. And there's lots of examples out there of farmers who have done this. It's not a theory, it's something that's been put into practice.
One thing that I try to get people to understand in this context again is food doesn't grow through force, which is kind of the industrial way of doing things, like clear the land, spray it with fertilizer, spray it with pesticide, put the seed, put the water on it. It's like this very forceful way of doing things. And food doesn't grow through force. Gardens and plants and soil grow through care. And this is what you were saying, David, like small scale agriculture is productive because there is more, it's all up for what I say, it's about the care per acre. And the care per acre is when you have people on the land caring for the land. And that's, this garden behind me here, it's a suburban home. So it's actually a hillside that was cut off. And what we've developed this garden on the soil that was the inside of a hill. And now we have 36 inches, that I can dig down into what was previously like concrete. And that is what care can offer. And that's what regenerative agriculture, I think, is all about. It's about increasing the amount of human, animal, plant care that the soil is getting.
So you were starting from scratch. I mean, that's awesome.
Similar story to the beginning of Hidden Half of Nature, right?
Yeah,
Dave?
yeah, very similar.
That's what Ann did in our garden as well. And it's, the optimistic side of this is that what you're demonstrating and what Ann did in our garden is showing that we can actually, through the intelligent application of care, from cultivating the beneficial life in the soil, we can actually rebuild soil and its fertility far faster than nature tends to, left to her own devices. If you'd had if the rock in that hillside that your place is on had been exposed by a landslide, it would take centuries, if not millennia, to do what you've done. And I don't know how long you've been doing it, but I'm going to guess that it's years to decade or two, and no longer. Then that's an order of magnitude or two faster than nature would do it. And this is something we could basically re-internalize. We could internalize as our collective vision of agriculture in terms of trying to rebuild the fertility of land. And if we start with the question of evaluating agricultural practices of what does it do to the health of the soil? What does it do to the ability of people to feed themselves, not this harvest, but 10 harvests from now in the future? We can reorient and reconceive. And the time scale at which we could make the transition is actually shockingly short if we really put our minds and our backs into it.
Quick interlude here. People who are just joining us, this webinar will be sent out to everyone again, a recorded version of it. So you will have access to it. Don't stress if you missed the beginning. And we wanted to just plug amazing books, both Dirt and The Hidden Half of Nature. I haven't finished Growing a Revolution, but those three books are what I would say in the top 10 list of must-haves in reading material for this soil health regenerative agriculture movement. And David Montgomery is the author of those books. So Please be sure to check those out. Seriously, amazing material. I know for myself, The Hidden Half of Nature was just such a key pillar for me to grasp the level of mutualistic relationships and moving our kind of separate mechanical mind into the natural mind that so many authors in this realm talk about, is grasping the evolutionary amount of evolution that's happened because of mutualistic relationships versus that of what we've long been taught, which is just this competitive version of competition, survival, blah, blah, blah. So it's a really pinnacle book for that. I wanted to jump into something here about this system shift, getting back into talking about a regenerative viewpoint and talking about holistic thinking, talking about the convergent mind, talking about these ways of looking at it. Another book that I'm getting an echo from someone's thing here, not sure. Another book that I love is Charles Macy's book, Call of the Reed Warbler. But in that book, he talks about a farmer who was dealing with this issue with his sheep, I believe it was. They had a parasite that they were always getting, and he noticed something. He saw this weedy bush that was kind of just like, maybe I'll take it out one day. But what was happening was the wild animals were coming and eating off of this bush. Lo and behold, they were using the bush as a way to defend themselves from this parasite. So what did he do? As a holistic practitioner of his land, he started cultivating that for his sheep, I think it was, to eat, and they were able to then defend themselves from this parasite. So when we start to look at moving humanity, and this is what I want to just have you jump into, David, in a second here, is when we start to look at humanity moving from the degenerative, the siloed, the mechanical mind over to the emergent regenerative mind, what's possible? And I don't want to make up that, yeah, we're going to solve coronavirus tomorrow. But when we start to move over to this perspective, all of the sudden solutions that, many indigenous native cultures already had, that will be rediscovered, but many more that now that we have scientific abilities that we never had before, microscopic abilities we never had before, what are some of the potential discoveries when we're inside of the emergent regenerative mind? So passing it over to you, David.
Well, what we've been seeing, I think, in the last few decades are people coming to actually understand the scientific underpinnings that had underlaid many traditional practices, and a lot of the insights of some of the original people, writing in English on organic agriculture. And, I speak English, so that's sort of as far back as I can take the literature. But it's, I think that our basic understanding of the world is really shifting. And it's shifting in a way towards recognizing the value of those mutualistic relationships and of the real power of that old cliche of, it's easier to work with nature because she bats last. There's real truth to that in terms of, if you're looking at, that fistful of soil holding more organisms than there are people on the planet, it's a lot better if they're working for the farmer rather than the farmer working against them, because they outnumber us an awful, they outnumber us in our own bodies. I mean, it's, our way of looking at the world is shifting, and that as that understanding grows, I think it gives us opportunities to think about new ways of doing things, because it gives us the understanding that enables us to do that and to take it forward. I'm one of those people who has never been very good at just following orders. I like to understand the why behind things I'm being asked to do. And that was what was so revealing about writing The Hidden Half of Nature for Ann and I, is that it revealed to us why it was that practices that cultivate life in the soil made for a better, more productive garden, and why eating a diet that was actually, similarly cultivating the beneficial life in our gut, led to a reduction in medicines and an improvement in health and those kinds of things. So I think we have opportunities to really reshape the way we think about the relationship between agriculture and medicine, which is two huge realms of human interaction, that if we start to actually understand that what we eat and how it was grown is actually influencing the nutritional profile of it, but also what the microbiome in our body's doing with it. it makes us start to think differently. And when we think differently, we start to act differently. And if we start to act differently, if enough of us do it, we can change a lot.
I want to go back to Finian, what your example here of the weed in the farmer's field too, because this is kind of very similar to the situation that we're in right now, right? We have this coronavirus, spreading over our planet, and in the garden, in the farm, we have these weeds that are spreading over our lands, and one way to view it is, here's this problem and we need to eradicate it. And the other way to view it is, what is this problem indicating to me? What is this, is it even a problem, right? Is that the problem? And how can we, through this shifted lens, really say, what is the lesson I'm being asked to learn right now? And, in the garden, I've understood very clearly, okay, the weed might be telling me that the soil is too compact, or that the soil wants to be covered, or that there's not enough food for insects and pollinators around. I'm not saying that I understand what the lesson is of coronavirus, but I think there is a lesson for us here. And maybe that, the other metaphor I'm starting to change in my head is we're always looking for the root of the problem. And when I started to understand that from a garden's perspective as well, does the plant have one root? And where does the plant emerge from? It emerges from the soil, and the soil nurtures those roots. So I'm starting to ask myself, what's the soil of the problem? So what is, what is the soil that this virus has emerged from? What is feeding it and allowing it to spread? I don't know if you have any input on that, David, or response to that.
Well, I love your analogy. I think that's fantastic, because it's basic. I've long argued that sort of context is huge for everything, and what you're basically arguing for is that instead of looking at the singular cause, look at the context that actually sets up the roots of the problem.
Yeah, but what I was wondering about, and I'm not giving any advice here, but one thing I've wondered about is, if I were to take this coronavirus and put it into a sterilized room, that's been wiped down with Lysol, and I were to take this coronavirus and then, I don't know, release it into my garden, like, how would it fare in either situation, or how would it spread? That's just like a question I've had in my mind.
I don't have the answer to that one either. I think sometimes when we look at the clean slate, maybe Lysol is a little bit too far because it probably just die, but the clean slate perspective, when we see clean, when we see farmers trying to, for example, keep land clean and remove litter and have the perfect rows of their tilled bare soil, sometimes that level of cleanliness in certain scenarios can lead to outbreaks of certain populations of bacteria or things that are all of a sudden getting to take advantage, and all of a sudden you have a major problem on your hands because of the imbalance.
There's very clear studies. Somebody's got a plane, I think, but there's clear studies of the effect of having sterile soil makes plants vulnerable to pests and pathogens. If you have a lower diversity of life in the soil, the plants tend to be more vulnerable to pests and pathogens. Pesticides and herbicides in particular, and to some degree insecticides. There's studies that show that plants are more vulnerable to disease pressures once they are subjected to those external disturbances. That's all stuff that we're putting together in the new book, but there's connections there that that can be picked up and looked at, but the soil is complicated, farming is complicated, and human health are complicated. So it's, linking the three is inherently complicated, but there's a lot that could be done. There's in the sort of the chat questions, people are asking about the nutritional quality of food grown with regenerative agriculture. And that's essentially the subject of the book Ann and I are working on now. And there's data that goes back to the 40s and 50s that pertain to that. It's not a simple picture, and it doesn't always work the way that you think it might work, but there's strong evidence that there are very real connections there.
So on this note, I want to talk a bit more. We don't have that much more time here, and I want to talk a bit more about what do we feel like is emerging right now inside of the perspective shifts. When we look at the phenomenon of the regenerative agriculture and healthy soils movement catching on, when we look at agencies now, I know from firsthand experience in the state of California, when we had just 7 years ago or more, a very dissected, siloed approach to looking at our water issues, to looking at our water pollution issues, to looking at our biodiversity loss issues, to looking at our fire issues, to looking at all of these major catastrophic issues are and were in a lot of places separated. So I wanted to throw over like what is emerging. So for example, when we look at water and what people are calling kind of the new water paradigm, if we look just 50 years ago at what the Army Corps of Engineers was framing, how they were framing the water conversation, and that transformation of looking at water as something we're just trying to get it out, it causes floods, it causes this, versus what we talked about looking at, well, maybe this is telling us something. Like the human connection to catching on to what Rishi was referring to before as this, well, what is the soil or what's the root of this problem? When we're looking at something as basic as water, when we look at infiltration rates moving from a ½ inch an hour to a ½ inch of water infiltrating in under 10 seconds in the course of 2 years on a ranch in Texas, that's 5,000 acres large. Those are catastrophic differences of how the water is an issue or a complete non-issue of flooding and drought stuff. So I wanted to talk a bit more about when we as humans are out there, as we have advocates on this call, we have people who've read your books, David, been in Rishi's course or Don and I's course, and they're advocates out there. How can we encourage them, or how can they be encouraged to try to help not make big false claims or not make claims that aren't real, but to say, wait a minute, humanity has been just going down this route of making decisions that aren't based on holistic frameworks. How can our people listening to this be stronger advocates for having the conversation of, hey, there's something deeper here. I'm not just a woo kind of person saying, well, you missed it. But like, no, we did miss it. Let's talk about water. Let's talk about human health. I want to talk about how we can encourage people to be a part of that. We're not saying we have a solution to this current pandemic right now, but we're saying our thinking is not very well set up for the future of more pandemics like this. Over to you, David.
Well, I think that basically, we're not going to be able to keep farming the way that we do now for very much longer. Now, I'm a geologist, so what's much longer? I mean centuries. We're not running out of soil tomorrow morning. And some of the numbers that have been figured around about how long we'll have to farm before we burn through our soil are kind of scaremongering. But the problem is very real in terms of feeding the future. And that as we were mentioning near the top of the hour, Finian, that we're degrading land still faster than we're repairing it. And we need to flip that around. And from whatever angle you want to look at the resilience of society, whether it's through viral outbreaks or whether it's through the availability of fresh water, through the climate lens, through the chronic disease lens, any of those lenses, one of the best investments we could make as a species at the moment is in rebuilding the health and fertility of our land, rebuilding our soil, because it will help with all of those problems. And in different ways and to different extents. I don't think it'll actually fix any of those problems. But what other single thing could help all of them?
There's a reason we say from the ground up, right? Literally need to start from the ground up.
Yeah.
And you see this in every farm and every garden you ever go to where people are working, looking at the soil health, you see that health builds around that. And so this is such, you know, in terms of this pandemic, and I think all the fear that a lot of us are feeling, you know, we're kind of being asked to stay at home and all this. And I think it's important for us to remember that it's, our relationships are so important. Our relationship with the soil is so important. I think what I heard you say, David, and a lot of what you mentioned today was you were talking about community, you were talking about participation, you were talking about coordination, you know, and you've been talking about in terms of soil life forms and plant roots and all, and that, but I think that's just a microcosm of our bigger world. And, you know, before, when we were prepping for this talk, I was talking to one of our fellow Kiss the Ground people, and she was saying it's so funny that they call it social distancing. It doesn't need to be social distancing, it's just physical distancing, right? So I think it's really important that we remember that it's the community, that we're part of this community, the soil community, the plant community, the earth community. So we don't need to ball up, you know, and hide. All we're needing to do right now is maintain some physical distance, right? We can
I think there's way more opportunity for online social connecting right now. So that's mute to me as well. I agree, Rishi. I wanted to finish off with two questions. First is kind of a statement question of, we can't antibiotic our way out of this. And what I'm throwing out there is, what if we're shifting? A lot of times people, when they're thinking about biology and especially microbiology, it's still through the filter of germs and that perspective. But when we understand that we are building the capacity of a balanced system to operate and function, when we're increasing biology on a multitude of different species and blah, blah, blah at the microbiology level, when we're seeing the resilience, when we're seeing what happens, the cascading effects of what happens for larger species, for bird populations, for bees, when you have the small microbes in the soil, what happens to the rest of the soil food web with all of those bigger microorganisms. When we're talking about being probiotic as this, in a sense, a complete different trajectory than antibiotic, in terms of saying, well, if we actually want human health resilience, and resistance to certain things, we kind of have to set the stage for the next 25 years to be on a probiotic version of working with nature, working with the world around us. Otherwise, we're going to be in the system where it's all on us. And that's what I tell, we see farmers all the time be like, how did your input costs go down so much? Well, because nature's doing 99% of my work for me, versus me having to be the one who's responsible for all this. So I wanted to have that conversation, and then we're being asked to finish off here with what can people do. So let's talk about the probiotic antibiotic conversation for a sec.
Well, you know, I think that the big opportunity that a regenerative agriculture, reorientation around regenerative agriculture presents us philosophically is to actually embrace the idea of cultivating life rather than mining it. And that is, you know, if you think about the very long picture of sustaining humanity on this planet, we have to figure out how to do that. Because it's going to be, we're going to be hard pressed to get a lot of us to Mars. It's going to be even harder to get out of the solar system. We've got this one home. It's the only place we know of that has soil, the only place we know of that has life. And we have to start thinking circularly about regenerating the soil even as we derive our food and our living from it. We have to think about that not just with food, but with fuel, fiber, and fodder, the things we feed our animals, the things that we wear, and the way that we, you know, power the electricity that we're all using to do this, as well as everything else that we power. You know, we've got to start thinking about how to use those systems in ways that maintains the ability to produce them. And again, nature is actually a really good role model for that. Nature works in cycles. The waste of one organism is usually the input of another one. Things get reused. a leaf falls to the floor of a forest, it doesn't just sit there forever. If it did, we'd be buried under leaves. It gets retooled and repurposed and ends up back in another tree after it's gone through the soil and soil life. We need to start applying that kind of thinking to our own economies and our own social structures. And, that isn't, each one of us out competing each other on our own. It's about figuring out designing systems that actually work for the collective us.
Absolutely.
Rishi, any more on that?
No, I think it is just about working together at the end of the day. It's about working together, and that's we have to remind ourselves that the together includes the soil, includes the plants, it includes the animals, it includes the insects, and it includes these viruses. No one's excluded from that.
Yeah.
Well, except they're not alive.
They're a weird phenomenon on this planet, I have to say.
Yeah, I think it's no question about whether we could go do without them. Most of them are not particularly useful. Perhaps my current state is coloring my thinking.
No, I hear it. And I just want to, again, acknowledge everyone for joining us on this webinar, and just restate that this wasn't about giving a solve for what we're currently facing, but hopefully a bit of new perspective and tools for each of you to share with your communities in the world of trying to usher in a bit more of what is emerging throughout this regenerative agriculture, healthy soils movement into any of the conversations, regenerative thinking in medical science, regenerative thinking in our food and how we're looking at our food systems across the board. This mentality of thinking can shift, and we, I think, collectively argue that it is the shift that needs to happen for humanity to be able to have a different relationship and moving from this lack and extractive tendency over to a place where there is more abundance and there is more safety net and more resilience, and we're not losing more species than we ever have to extinction, et cetera. So hopefully we shared some things. Some people said our questions were too long. That's because most of my questions are secretly also statements. That's the problem that I have. But I thank everyone for joining. And David left a note here. I think if you have not read David's books, him and Ann created some phenomenal pieces of literature for this movement. Please read those. For Kiss the Ground, check out our website, start to get to know the resources. Sign up for the waiting list for one of the next courses if you haven't taken them. Also, there's more announcements coming out for Kiss the Ground, the movie, so you can get on that list on the website to find out how you can get involved with the premiering of the movie and helping with that. And then additionally, a lot of news coming out where you'll be able to help with campaigns and policy. So become a member of Kiss the Ground so you can stay abreast of all that. For all of you who are advocates, we'll see you tomorrow on the All Advocate webinar, all the past advocate graduates. So anything else, last statements, folks, before we close out?
Just to say, for people who are new to Kiss the Ground, we have 2 courses. Finian is the teacher of the Soil Advocate training, and I'm the teacher of the Regenerative Gardening and Living course. So he mentioned you can sign up for our waiting lists. We're going to be announcing the next sessions of the courses soon. You can sign up for those waiting lists on kisstheground.com, as well as becoming a member and supporting our work so that we can offer more webinars like this, more interesting conversations with people like David. Yeah.
Finian and Rishi, it's a pleasure to talk to you both. Let's do it again. Take care and stay well.
Thank you all so much. And I'm going to stay on for a second, try to answer some of these questions on the side here, but we're going to let David Montgomery go. And thank you so much for joining us, David. We appreciate your work and what you've done to help this movement move into the I think we're all seeing it now. It's moving into the collective spotlight for climate, for human health, et cetera. So thank you for all your work to make that happen. Appreciate it.
Thank you, and vice versa. Cheers.
And give our regards to Ann, please. Thanks.
Will do. See you next time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, folks, I'm going to stay on here. We got some questions. What is the soil? Because it's a great news story. Started with David.
There's a bunch of questions going back here.
I'm going to start from the bottom. Thanks, David. That's so great. Okay.
Okay. I think
one for you about bananas.
I owe you bananas.
I
Okay.
think the time, Rachel, I think the time is still 9:30 for tomorrow's webinar. I will check on that, but I think it's still 9:30 to 11. Okay,
Okay.
we'll be sending, okay.
If anyone submitted any gardening questions, feel free to just email them to me, rishi@farmerrishi.com. I have to get going to another appointment. It was nice to be here with you, Finn, and I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation.
Thank
Bye.
you, Rishi. Take care. Yeah, someone just mentioned the silver lining of emissions reductions because less people are moving around, traveling. So that is a silver lining. What kind of policy can we push to make this happen? That's a great question, but just a quick bit on that. Looking inside of the state of California and with our governor and the first partner, Jennifer Newsom, they're both looking, I think, much more holistically at the human health perspective. So when we start to make deals, for example, inside of the government, purchasing agreements where government's saying, okay, well, we want our schools, our children to be eating the best food possible. And we can start with eliminating food that is grown in a degenerative way, and especially in a way that is producing food that is laden with chemicals. So getting inside of local governments, helping food purchasing decisions like that can be a huge catalyst for introducing this conversation, getting people to start thinking about ways that they can start sourcing food for their children that's better for them, better for their health, and better for the environment. So that's a great answer for that one, I think, for right now. David, we'll do, David, that's a note from David. Let's see if there's a question here. Okay, is there a place for hydroponic farming? Great question. We're definitely proponents of aquaculture. Hydroponic sometimes it can, in most cases, is dealing with an extraction or extractive situation where you're having to deal with quite a lot of waste and quite a lot of inputs to make that system work, as opposed to a regenerative system in most aquaculture systems that are actually helping to take a body of water that's utilizing and planting inside of, to have that working on a biological level versus a chemical input level. So that would be the answer, my answer, short answer to that. Looking for more questions. What is one thing we can do? David said, read his books. Okay, other questions, looking for question marks here. Send to Bill Gates? Yes, let's get Bill Gates more understanding. I don't think Bill Gates has ill intentions, as some might have painted out. I think he just doesn't quite grasp what it means to be supporting chemical agriculture in the way that he has been doing. I think he can convert to the regenerative mind, and please help do that if you can. What does the future of agriculture look like? We hope that the future of agriculture is regenerative. It kind of has to be, otherwise humans are on a dire trajectory.